Consumer Credit Panel. And the other is a study on arbitration that sort of helped create some new wheels of cheese, some new kinds of data. And the first presenter will be Ken Brevoort, who is right here.
All right, good morning. So today I'm going to be talking about a piece of research that is actually brand new. I think it became public on Tuesday. There it is shown to your left. It's available on our website. It's a piece of research that tries sort of, I think, really humble origins. What we're trying to do here is pretty basic. Understanding the credit reporting system is something that has been a priority for the Bureau and for the Office of Research. Credit reporting is tremendously important to the lives of consumers. Credit reports are very frequently used not only in credit granting, but they also have important implications in underwriting insurance markets, making decisions about rental, who a landlord will rent to, and in some cases even in employment verification, deciding if this is somebody you want to hire. And because of this importance, we've put a lot of effort into developing a lot of different data sources that are going to give us information about people who have credit records. Right? One of those data sources is what we're calling the Consumer Credit Panel. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. It is one of these big wheels of cheese, as Chris has mentioned. But today, what I really want to focus on the people who stand outside the wheel of cheese, right? People who have not yet made it into that wheel. And these are the people who ultimately don't have credit records. This is what we're going to call the credit invisible population. For these people, if they want to access credit markets, particularly if they want to access traditional credit markets, things like mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, what have you, a lot of lenders base those decisions on either reviewing a credit record, which gives information about a person's credit history, or on a credit score, which in a lot of cases, such as the FICO score or the Vantage score, or any of the many scores that they offer. In those cases, those scores are going to be based entirely on the information in credit records, and those people who do not have records are not going to have scores that are going to be generated. The lenders that therefore depend upon these are ultimately, in a lot of cases, going to be much less likely to issue forms of credit to these populations. So this is going to be a group of people that are having a much harder time accessing traditional credit markets. Now, understanding the credit invisible population is particularly difficult, largely because these people are outside of most traditional data sets. Right? We can pull a sample of credit records and get pretty good information about the credit records of people who have credit records. We have absolutely no data about the people who are outside of that system. Other data sets that do have nationally representative samples of all consumers, like even if they're very well done, like the Survey of Consumer Finances, probably have information on people who are credit invisible, but ultimately they don't have anything that allows you to identify those people, right? There's nothing in the SCF that will say, yes, this is an observation of data that comes from somebody who does not have a credit record. So we traditionally have not known a lot about the number of credit invisibles. To the extent that you see numbers about this population, a lot of them are hard to track down. I actually spent a day doing this. I went to refereed publications and I found where they talked about the number of people who did not have credit records. Largely, these were studies that were done using credit record data, some of which I have written myself. And you say, clearly, this does not apply to the 22 million people or so that do not have credit records. And then I'd go through the footnotes to try to figure out where that source came from. And generally, they would cite somebody else who cited a blog, who cited a USA Today report from 2006, who cited somebody who said, yeah, the number is 22 million. And so a lot of it, there's been really nothing that I could see that has actually attempted to, in a quantitative method, or in a quantitative way, or a rigorous way, go at this population. So what we're going to try to do in this study is add some light onto exactly the characteristics, not only the number of these people, but their characteristics. And one of the reasons why you should care about the characteristics is that when you think about this population that doesn't have credit records, a lot of the attention has flown toward different forms of what generally are called alternative data that might be brought to bear. Right? If there are people who are credit invisible to traditional credit history scoring models, maybe if we bring in additional information on rental histories or utility payments, maybe based upon that we can actually make decent assessments of the creditworthiness of these people. Now, certainly there are reasons to question the usefulness of that data. I'm not meaning to sort of suggest that that is at all clear, but one of the important things to consider is that a lot of these studies that have sort of looked at alternative data, what they generally do is, for example, if you're using a study of utility data, you go out, you get a random sample of consumers who have utility payment information, you then pull their credit records, and you sort of see how much additional lift you get from that information. The problem with this is that you don't really know anything about how representative that group is of the people who are credit invisible. You could do a study, for example, that shows that rental history is the most predictive form of information that has ever been discovered. But if it turns out that only 1 or 2% of the people are credit invisible, have rent in their own name, or have utility payments that are in their own name, your ability to use that information to score these people is going to be substantially limited. And that's one of the dimensions of the alternative data story, or a lot of the research that's been done on alternative data that they're really missing. And it's the type of thing that this research agenda is going to start to get into, that we won't get there fully today. Oops. Wow, I had no preamble. So the basic idea is, as I said, we're looking at people who did not have credit records. And so the comparison we're going to make is we're going to compare those people who are in our sample of credit records. So we have assembled something called the Consumer Credit Panel. It is a 1 in 48 sample of de-identified credit records. Right? So we basically know the entire contents of the credit records of these consumers, minus anything that would directly identify the people. We do not know their name, we don't know their social security number, we don't know their date of birth, though we do know their year of birth, and we don't know their address. But we do know the fact that they have credit records, and we do know where they live in the broad census tract sense, right? Again, we don't know the address, but we know within a broad geography, namely a census tract, that those consumers were there. So based upon this random sample for 2010, we can compare the distribution of consumers in the CCP, or the distribution of credit records in the CCP, with the distribution of the US population according to the 2010 decennial census. And that's basically what we're going to do. So we're going to use the CCP to tell us how many consumers in each census tract across the United States have credit records. We're then going to compare that to the number of adults in the census tract in 2010 according to the decennial census who live there. And that differential is going to be our estimate of the number of people who are credit invisible. Now we're also going to look at a second group. I should say, when we use the term credit invisible, it is not something that we invented here at the Bureau. It's been used by others. And a lot of the others who have used it somewhat more broadly. So they've meant credit invisible not only to refer to those people who don't have credit records, but also to those people whose credit records could not be scored. Sometimes these are called the unscorables. The issue with the unscorables is a little bit different. Someone with an unscorable record is somebody who has a record that has insufficient information so that when the person building the credit scoring model built it, they had to make a determination about how much information was enough to reliably generate a prediction about that person's creditworthiness. And they had to draw a line to say, okay, in order to be scored under our model, whether it be the FICO model, the VantageScore model, or any of the proprietary models that lenders themselves use, they had to make some determination about these types of credit records will be scored, these we're not going to be able to score. And these people also, much like the people who have no credit records, will have a substantially harder time accessing traditional credit markets. But ultimately, the definition of what is an unscorable consumer is going to depend critically on the model being used. Some models have much narrower definitions of what is an unscorable credit record. Some have much broader. So what we're going to do is we also want to look at people who have unscorable credit records using a particular model that we have, or a particular score that we have access to, which is commercially available and we believe is representative of most of the models used in practice today. And we're also going to look at that population. So we're going to look at not only people who don't have credit records, but we're going to look at people whose credit records did not appear to be scorable at the time of 2010 when this data was drawn.
I was told we could interrupt, so
Okay, yeah.
I'm going to indulge. How did you deal with immigrant status, right? So we know if the census is your baseline, that the degree of undercount varies in a systematic way. Did you make adjustments for that in this?
We didn't. So we do talk in the report about the undercounting in the census. It's actually buried in a footnote where we do talk about sort of the implications of the fact that the Hispanic population, according to the census's post-enumeration study, was undercounted by about 2.1%. And if, in fact, we find that the census population has been undercounted for some of these groups, we are going to be able to sort of blow up the estimates a little bit. Enough of it is sufficiently straightforward that I don't think we've done it yet, but it would be fairly straightforward. Because if the census is undercounted, all that means is that our estimate of the number of credit invisibles is ultimately lower than it should be. That makes sense? Okay, and so when we think about the people who did not have scorable credit records or credit records that were scored by the particular model that we were looking at, there are basically two different types. And we want to look at these differently too, because they potentially have different problems and they potentially have different solutions. The first type are what we're going to be called insufficient unscorables. These are people whose credit records are too thin or contain too little information to reliably generate a credit scoring model. The second group is going to be slightly different. These are going to be people who potentially have large credit histories, but there's no recent information in their credit record. So if you're building a credit scoring model, you're not only concerned about the type of information that's there or how much is there, you're also really concerned about the recentness of it. Because if you see a population that hasn't been using credit for a long period of time, and suddenly they start, you know something fundamentally there has changed. And I think the credit scoring modelers believe that their ability to predict in those sorts of environments is substantially diminished. So these credit scoring models, when they don't score somebody, will generally tell you the reason why. And the reasons that we're going to be using here are the reasons that were reported with the score that we're using. So again, we're going to be looking at 3 different populations: those individuals who are credit invisible in that they don't have a credit record, those who are unscored because of an insufficient history, and those that were unscored because of a stale history. Now the graph here, shown above, is our estimate by age group of the number of people who are credit invisible. The top graph shows the share of consumers who are credit invisible by each of a number of different ages. We're doing this by age bucket because that's the way the census produces its numbers. It's also convenient for the way that we have the data as well. And what you can see from the top graph in particular is that if you're 18 or 19 years old, which is the first group, your likelihood of being credit invisible is pretty high, right? As you start out your adult life, you probably haven't accumulated a lot of credit cards, you don't have a lot of credit history, your likelihood of being credit invisible is pretty high. It's a little bit over 50%. And then as you age, that ratio falls fairly substantially. And over the course of the different age groups, we find that it eventually levels out around middle age. And then as you get older and older, you tend to see that the number of credit invisibles drifts up a little bit. In terms of the people with unscorable records, we also see that there tends to be a substantial pattern across age groups as well. Right? The younger you are, the more likely you are to have an unscorable credit record because of an insufficient history. Older individuals are much less likely to be unscored because they have an insufficient credit history. An interesting pattern that emerges, and I think it's particularly viewable in the bottom graph, is if you look at the people who are unscorable because of a stale credit history. I was a little bit surprised about these results. A stale credit history seems to affect more people in middle age than I would have expected. Right? I'd expected sort of a simplified version of sort of credit history, right? You start out early in life, you have no credit history, eventually you accumulate it, that then increases your likelihood of having a credit record and of being scored. And then as you get later in life, once you stop using credit as heavily, eventually your accounts age, then the staleness starts to hit in, and then you become unscorable. But stale credit record seems to hit a lot more of the middle age portion of the bucket than I would have imagined. Now, one of the other cuts we were interested in looking at was how this differs by income. So what we did is we took all those census tracts that we had, and we went to the 2008 to 2012 American Communities Survey, also produced by the Bureau of the Census. And we divided census tracts based upon their household income. So we took the median household income and divided it by the median household income of either the metropolitan statistical area they lived in or the county. And then we used the similar definitions to what's used in the Community Reinvestment Act for designating neighborhoods by income level. If your income was below 50% of the surrounding area, you were a low-income community. If the census tract had an income between 50 and 80, it was a moderate income area. 80 to 120 was middle. 120 or above was an upper income area. And what we see here, the graph on the left is a distribution of consumers who have or are either credit invisible or have an unscored credit record. The graph on the right is the share of consumers within each of these groups. So what you see on the left is that when you think about the people who are credit invisible, most of them tend to live in middle-income communities. But that should not be terribly surprising because that's where most of the US population lives as well. But if you look at the graph at the right, what you see is that there is a really stark pattern between the neighborhood income level in which you reside, of the census tract in which you reside, and your likelihood of being credit invisible or having an unscored credit record. If you're in a lower income community, about 30% of those people appear to be credit invisible, meaning that they have no credit record. Your likelihood of being either credit invisible or having an unscored credit record is approaching 50%. As income levels of the community you're in go up, those numbers fall substantially, so that if you're in an upper income community, your odds of being either credit invisible or unscorable fall dramatically. Now, another category that we wanted to look into was the issue of race or ethnicity. There's been a lot of attention, I think, particularly in some of the studies that have been done so far, that look at the importance of alternative data, particularly for minority communities. So we wanted to come up with an estimate of how many of these people, how many of these credit invisibles and how many of these people with unscored credit records were of different races or ethnicities. So to estimate this, what we did is we used the information from the 2000 decennial census about the racial and ethnic composition of the people who lived in these different tracts. And we assume within each tract that if we have 10 credit invisibles, within each tract, if we have 10 credit invisibles, we assume that those individuals are distributed across the race or ethnicities with the same proportion as the adult population of that tract. Right, so essentially, we're going to estimate this using entirely cross-census tract variation. We're going to assume within census tracts there is no variation. Probably not the best assumption we could have made. It's pretty standard in these types of analyses, but I do think it's going to suggest that we're going to undercount some of the results. But as sort of a first look, I think this is probably a good way to do it. And we're going to look specifically at a few different ethnicities. In particular, we're going to look at 4 in this presentation. The first are Hispanic or Latinos. And then we're going to look amongst the non-Hispanic or non-Latino community at blacks or African Americans, Asians, and non-Hispanic whites as well. And so when we calculate these estimates, we see the patterns look like this. Right? Again, not surprisingly, most of the people who are credit invisible or unscored tend to be non-Hispanic whites. But if you look at the share of consumers, the incidence of being credit invisible is much higher if you are Hispanic or a non-Hispanic black or African American. It's much less if you are non-Hispanic white or non-Hispanic Asian. Interestingly, the percentage of Hispanics who are credit invisible is a little bit higher than the percentage of blacks, but it seems that the black population has a higher incidence of being unscored, both because of an insufficient credit history and because of being stale, or having a stale credit history. Now, we're also able to do this comparison for different age groups. Let's try to come up with an idea of exactly how much this varies by age. And so I want to be very clear about this, because sometimes when I talk about this, I tend to be a little bit sloppy in the words that I use. What we're doing is we're ultimately looking at a cross-section here. Right? So we're looking at a period of time, and we're going to compare different age groups. So our ability to sort of say how your likelihood of being credit invisible as you age changes, right? Because we're not following people through time. Right? So these differences that we're going to observe could be cohort effects, they could be age effects. We're not going to be able to disentangle those two. So if I'm fairly certain that when I'm about to say, you're going to hear me say things that appear to contradict that, I'm just asking that you keep that in mind, even if I'm a little bit sloppy about it. So what we have on the left graph in this case is the incidence of being credit invisible by age for the white population. Now, for all the different racial groups, we generally find that the overall patterns tend to be almost identical. So we're presenting them here a little bit differently to heighten some of the contrast. So the left graph you have, what we're using is the sort of baseline population, the white population. And then in the right graphs, what we've done is we've taken the rates, the incidences for each of the different racial groups, and we've subtracted that, or we've subtracted the incidence for whites from that. So for example, if you look at the white population in the 20 to 24-year-old group, the incidence of being credit invisible is about 20%. If you then go to the right graph and you look for the black population at 20 to 24, their differentials with whites is about 4%. So what that tells you is that if you add the two together, the incidence for the black population is about 24%. So that's basically what we're showing you. But what you can see in the right graph is that for the Hispanic population, the black population in particular, there seems to be a positive differential that persists over the course of their lives. Right? We can't necessarily say that, how this plays out over the lifetimes of these people, but I do think that this suggests rather strongly that these differences in terms of the likelihood of being credit invisible start very early in the lives of these consumers and then persist thereafter. For the Asian population, who generally had a likelihood of being credit invisible that was comparable to non-Hispanic whites, you see some age differences. Early in life, or at least at young ages in 2010, they seem to be a little bit more likely to be credit invisible, a little bit less likely to be credit invisible middle age, and the older Asian individuals were much more likely to be credit invisible. So I think some of the aggregate differences that we saw tended to mask some of these inter-age differences. We can also do the same exact calculation for those who are insufficient unscored. These are the people who had credit records, but they did not have enough information in their credit record to generate a score. The left graph shows the pattern for whites. Not surprisingly, you could see sort of what I was expecting, which was as people age, the likelihood of them being credit invisible grows or falls substantially. The differential across the different racial groups, again, there seems to be a persistence here. For the blacks and Hispanics, generally at young ages, there was a pretty substantial differential. It seemed to decline as the consumers got older, but ultimately it did tend to persist over the course of their lifetimes. If you compare the Asian population with the white population, there does seem to be a pattern across ages, but generally it's within 1 percentage point, suggesting that there wasn't a whole lot of difference. And finally, for the stale unscored population, again, consistent with what we saw earlier, the stale unscored for whites tends to maximize in middle age and tends to decline thereafter. The patterns across the racial groups tend to be dramatically higher for blacks and Hispanics, and for Asians it tends to be similar to what we observe for the white population. And then this is just the pattern for people who actually have scored records. You generally find that your likelihood of having a scored record goes up as you age. It tends to hold steady over time. And again, Asians have a pattern relatively consistent to non-Hispanic whites, whereas for blacks and Hispanics, there tends to be a substantial difference. Any questions? We haven't. I would feel a little bit hesitant to do that until we get individual level data. Ultimately, since we're just doing, I think doing it at a geographic level is a bit too blunt an object to really be able to make that find a distinction.
So, any questions from ARC members?
I was just going to make one comment. I think this is really great. I think that this is exactly what I meant by know your customer earlier. That we understand people's needs at this broad level. What ages, what types of populations are failing to have credit, failing to have access to credit, and that's going to help us understand what are the government policy products that can best serve those people. So I'm really a big fan of understanding the populations that we're trying to serve so that we can serve them better.
So in terms of the interpretation, one thing one might say is that this is just a characteristic of the industry in terms of who is going to get scored, who's not going to get scored, and then we should react to this in other ways that we regulate consumer credit. Another way to think about it is how the industry should be prompted to maybe work harder to score these unscored individuals. Now, of course, that raises the question of whether we're doing these very young households, and they typically are very young, a favor by giving them credit at a point in their lives where there's some ambiguity about whether they'll use the credit well or not. Of course, one can make arguments on either side. Do you have a sense of whether we should move in the direction of trying to encourage scoring for these young households who are the overwhelmingly unscored types in this study, or is it more that you're documenting this and reserving judgment about whether we want to encourage scoring for these particular demographic groups?
So I think that's a great question, and it's actually one of the harder ones to wrestle with when you talk about alternative data. Because ultimately, when you think about scoring these people and giving them more access to the credit market, you really want to make sure that you're giving credit to people who have a chance of successfully managing that credit. And to build a credit scoring model that actually does that successfully, you have to observe the performance of the likely performance of these people. And these are people who generally have not been accessing a lot of traditional credit market, or a lot of traditional credit, which is why they don't have credit records in the first place. So it's really hard at this point to make any definitive statements about how many of these people, if they had access to these credit markets, how many would be successful and under what considerations. So I'm really hesitant to make any sort of predictions right now about how, to the extent to which we should sort of have policy efforts or industry-driven efforts to necessarily push things out. I'm generally more a fan of taking a more cautious approach and actually seeing, all right, let's see if there are other forms of alternative data that might be there where these people, we could use this information to identify those people who we think, yes, this is somebody who really seems to have the financial acumen to really be able to successfully understand the debt that they're taking on and pay it back in a successful way.
So this is an interesting domain for a randomized control trial. One could imagine an intervention that would create credit access and credit histories for a randomly selected population, and then look to see how the exogenous creation of credit access. For example, one could imagine giving them some credit, creating a little credit history, which would then move them from the unscored category to the scored category, and then following them over the next 3, 4, 5 years and asking, did our effort to create scoring improve their financial lives, improve their financial well-being, or lead to credit access that was in fact self-defeating?
Yeah, I think that would be fairly fascinating because I do think there are some industry efforts in particular that are going on underway that are going to try to start to expand credit using some of these alternative data. And I don't think they've actually considered the idea of using randomization in those.
Our last presentation will be by Alexei Alexandrov and Kelvin Chen, who will be talking about our recent arbitration study that was released a few weeks ago.
2 months ago. Thank you, Chris. First of all, this study has about 700 pages, and it's 9 papers stitched together. And so I'm just going to give a quick overview of the study, and I'm not going to go too far into details. The study was jointly done by the Office of Research and Office of Card Markets, and it was expertly managed by Kelvin Chen, who is sitting right here. And yep, he's going to tackle me if I misspeak about anything in the study. Let me see. Where is the clicker? Oh, okay. Green is for perfect. Okay. So first of all, what are we talking about? What is arbitration? What are mandatory arbitration clauses? Why are we studying them? First of all, we're just studying them in the consumer finance space, so that's the first thing that you need to know about the study. Second of all, what are arbitration clauses? Well, arbitration clauses are just a clause where 2 parties that sign a contract agree to resolve any disputes that arise after they sign the contract using the help of arbitrator as opposed to going to court. And the mandatory arbitration clause effectively gives each of the parties an option when another party sues this party to just take the dispute out of the court system and into arbitration. What does the Bureau have to do with any of this? Well, the Bureau was mandated by the Congress in the Dodd-Frank Act to provide a report to the Congress of mandatory arbitration clauses in the consumer finance space. And on top of that, the Congress also gave the Bureau the authority to regulate the arbitration clauses in the consumer finance space. But notice the last sentence on the slide. The last sentence on the slide says that the findings of this rule should be consistent with the studies that we have just provided. The study took years to make, and we started with a request for comments from the industry and any interested parties like consumer groups and academics and so on. We received a bunch of comments there. Then we released preliminary results after that. And then the study was released finally 2 months ago. What were the topics that we studied? Well, the first one is, well, how prevalent are these arbitration clauses? So we literally went through many of the consumer finance markets, and we looked at the contracts that firms provided to consumers, and we looked whether those contracts actually had arbitration clauses. One notable consumer finance space where the arbitration clauses are just not present are mortgages. And there's a historic reason for that, but also because the Congress outlawed mandatory arbitration clauses in the Dodd-Frank Act in the mortgage space. So basically, all those findings are for consumer markets that are not the mortgage market. One of the markets in particular that is interesting to talk about in this space is the credit card market. And I'll tell you why a little bit later too, but in particular for now. Right now, about 50% of the consumer contracts in the credit card space have a mandatory arbitration clause. But this number was about 90% in 2009. And the reason why this number went down from 90% in 2009 to 50% right now is that there was an antitrust case against many of the larger issuers. And some of those larger issuers settled that case, and the settlement was that they're going to take out those mandatory arbitration clauses from their contracts. So because 4 large issuers settled that case in 2009, right now we went down from 90% mandatory arbitration clauses to 50%. Please keep this in mind because I will use this case a little bit later on to talk about one more part of the study that we have done. The next question is, what do those clauses contain? Aside just from the fact that, well, if either of the parties, either the firm or the consumer exercises this clause, then the dispute leaves the court system and goes into arbitration. Well, one of the provisions that virtually all the mandatory arbitration clauses that we looked at contained was a no-class arbitration provision. And what this means is that effectively each firm has an option to stop any class action proceeding either in court or in arbitration, because once it gets to court, the firm can invoke the mandatory arbitration clause and move it to the arbitration system. And once it's in the arbitration system, the firm can invoke the no-class arbitration provision. So this is one of the reasons why those clauses are important. Then we went on to study just how much the consumers know about the existence of such arbitration clauses. And even by introspection, you should know that it's probably not much. And this is exactly what we found, because we found 1,000 consumers, 1,007, well, actually more, but 1,007 of them had credit cards, and we asked them about the clauses in their credit card contracts. And of course, out of the 1,007 consumers, only a few happened to be lawyers, so we did not have that many consumers who actually knew much about the arbitration clauses. The fun part about the survey was that we actually had the contracts of the credit card issuers on record, and we asked each consumer, who was your issuer for the credit card that you're describing to us? And then we could compare the issuer that they provided to us with the contract that we have on record. So we actually know whether their contract has a mandatory arbitration clause or not. So we can ask them questions about their rights and effectively see whether they know about their rights or do not. And it turned out that consumers who have a mandatory arbitration clause and the consumers who do not have a mandatory arbitration clause basically answered the same way to all questions that we asked. So there was no statistical difference between their answers. So then we moved on. Once we studied consumers' understanding, we decided we should look at basically what happens in arbitration, but also we can't just look at what happens in arbitration without looking at what happens in other forums. So we looked at what happens in arbitration, we looked at what happens with individual cases in federal courts, in small claims court, and in state courts to the extent that we could. And then we moved on to class action cases in federal courts as well. There are many things that we found about individual arbitration and individual litigation, but the important point that I want to get across here, given the lack of time, is that there just weren't that many of them. So in particular, there were under 1,000 cases per year in arbitration for consumer finance space, for the whole consumer finance space. There were about on the same order of magnitude number of cases in the federal individual cases and in the small claims courts that we could find. And the small claims that we could find represent about 30% of the US population. So the point is that the number of consumers who go to court individually or to arbitration individually to resolve such consumer finance dispute is really small. Basically, we also went further into this and tried to see what happened exactly in arbitration and in individual litigation. But it is really hard to compare simply because many consumers settle their disputes, and we do not observe what happened in that settlement. And also, you would think that there is some selection, potentially at least. So it is hard to compare the two forms. After this, we went to see what happens in class actions. Well, for class actions, it was a completely different number of consumers involved. And the number of consumers involved in class actions were millions of consumers per year for the 5 years that we studied. And then we also looked, since class action settlements are available to public, we actually looked at how much money consumers received. And by how much money consumers received, we do not mean vouchers. We mean actual cash that consumers received either as an automatic payment or claims that they made and actually received payments on. And we found that consumers received about $1 billion in the 5 years that we studied in the class actions. We did a few other things, but I'm going to skip for the time pressure. But the last thing that we have done in this study is that we examined whether the arbitration clauses lead to lower prices for consumers. This is, of course, a really hard question to actually examine. And so we did our best to examine this question. That would be how I would put it. One of the reasons why it's really hard to study, in particular in this context, is that when we were looking at the prevalence of arbitration clauses, we found that bigger firms tend to have the arbitration clauses more often than smaller firms. So, of course, the usual correlation versus causation question comes into play. And ideally, we would have some kind of a randomized experiment, but of course, we do not have anything like this. The closest thing that we could get is the case that I was talking about just 5 minutes ago. And that case, again, to remind you, was few large credit card issuers got sued. Some of them settled, some of them did not. The ones that settled ended up taking out arbitration clauses of their contracts for the next, well, until now, actually, and they're still out. The other issuers that settled, or that did not settle, did not actually have to pay anything, at least until now. So as of now, they're free of this case. And we also had issuers that did not even get sued in the first place. So then what we did is that we compared issuers that settled versus everyone else. And of course, an important question is, well, what exactly are you comparing for the issuers that settled versus everyone else? And ideally, we would have some kind of a price, but then what is a price in the credit card context? So what we used is the total cost of credit. And the total cost of credit is just a variable that aggregates all the interest and all the fees that consumers pay on their credit card. And this is a measure that we used before in one of our reports. This is a measure that was used in academic literature as well. So we felt reasonably comfortable that this is a measure to look at, as opposed to looking at each fee separately, just because there are so many different fees and interest rates that we would find some effects simply because of the high number of things that we're looking at. So for that total cost of credit, we looked at the standard difference in difference approach, where we compared the total cost of credit of the issuers that settled and the issuers that did not settle before the settlement, and then we compared with the difference after the settlement. We did not find any statistically significant effects, despite looking at many different cutoffs in terms of time, and like when we would think that this cost increase potentially would come in and be reflected in prices. And despite looking at different various cutoffs of the total cost of credit, just because we would not want to have, for example, the total cost of credit reflects the fact that there was a 12-month introductory rate. So we looked at different various total costs of credit. And yeah, so with that, I will leave off because, I mean, it's an academic audience, so you all know the ups and downs of not finding statistically significant effects and difference in differences. Yeah, sure. Okay, sure. So let me ask the first question. Yep, so the first question is, for the survey of consumers, we used random digit dialing telephone survey, and there were a couple of reasons for using that method. The first reason was that it's widely accepted. The second reason is that if we're asking consumers about their knowledge of a specific topic which we're not sure whether they know about, we do not want them Googling the answers or Googling the questions and trying to figure out whether they have an arbitration clause, what is an arbitration clause, and so on and so forth, and what their rights are. The question to you is whether it makes sense in the future to lean more on internet-based surveys, and whether, because they're cheaper and faster. But of course, there might be some downsides as well. For example, something like they can Google the answers.
So educate me on an issue here. With arbitration, is there any legal format for class action in arbitration? Or is arbitration inherently unable to go down that path?
So, and Kelvin will, well, go ahead. No.
So the parties could agree to put class provisions into the agreement, and so there was a mechanism for class arbitrations, but we were only able to find 2 purported class action filings in an arbitration over the 3-year period that we studied.
So one way to think about this is there's sort of 2 steps. The first step is arbitration without class action, and as one thinks about possible reforms, there's arbitration with class action, and then there's just abandoning arbitration altogether. And I guess from the optimal policy domain, it's not obvious whether the key ingredient here is abandoning class action or whether the key ingredient is bringing in, whether the key ingredient is abandoning arbitration, whether the key ingredient is incorporating class action.
So you raise a lot of very interesting policy questions, and that's actually where the Bureau is. Sorry. You raise a lot of very interesting policy questions, and that's frankly where the Bureau is starting to head now. And now that we've got the study under the statutory framework, the Bureau has a lot of very difficult questions that it has to consider. Whether or not there are issues with individual arbitration, which a lot of consumer advocates would say, for instance, the lack of consumer awareness, or for instance, the lack of a jury trial, versus a lot of the benefits that arbitration has to offer. And so there is now, one of the things that's been very neat about this project is that it's touched on a lot of the 4 corners, I guess the 3 corners of research, markets, and regulations, because now there's a regs team that has taken our findings and is really kind of chewing through them and thinking through what the next step should be.
I wanted to just step back a little bit and say how extraordinary I think it is that you've been able to undertake this. One of the most striking things about arbitration is it replaces a system that is quintessentially open, courts, right? You have a legal right to be in a courtroom and observe a trial, barring some unusual circumstance like a rape victim or a juvenile. The records from those legal proceedings are public. Often now they're on the internet. We can study them. And when a consumer signs a contract that says instead of being able to challenge a matter in court, the consumer's agreeing to arbitrate it, not only is the consumer changing his or her rights, but we as researchers and policymakers are or have been until this effort, fundamentally changed in our ability to study the system in question. And so I just want to underline in the strongest possible terms, I mean, I applaud Congress for putting this provision in the Dodd-Frank Act, but I especially applaud the Bureau for going out and trying to get information on how these secret or not automatically public proceedings operate. And I remember the first time I attended one in a professional capacity, not as a consumer, and I had like many lawyers had clerked at courts, including here in Washington, and I walked into this small hotel conference room, and the windows were all drawn, the curtains were closed. And it was almost like a star chamber. So just to be able to, and I mean, that's not to criticize arbitration, but it is to say, let's to have the ability to actually have data on the system so we can study it. And that's really what's happening here. And I really can't convey how great I think it is.
I just wanted to kind of second what Christine is saying. I think it's wonderful that you guys are doing this study and that you're working on this important question. And I had not actually really thought about the point that you just made, Christine, that basically we're taking information and learning out of the system by kind of forcing everything to be done one-on-one behind closed doors. And from the company's point of view, like think about where that puts the corporation versus the individual or the government. They have access to all of that information because it's the same company on the other side of the table. And so you've just given them a huge information advantage in aggregating information and learning about how to handle these cases that you've now taken away from the individual and from the agency that's there to protect the individual, namely the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the US government. I also one of the great things about this slide that David and I were having some fun with our little calculators here, just thinking about, this staggering number, in my opinion, of $540 million per year in average settlements after legal fees. So now if I do the back of the envelope calculation back up and I say, well, let's just assume that these settlements were done because there were likely actually damages, the damage number per year is in the billions. I mean, like 17, I don't know if I did my math right. I have some placeholders for what the legal fees were and what the settlement is to actual damages under some assumptions. You could get this to around, that seemed reasonable to me, around $17.5 billion a year just in the things that you found. And now if I look and I see there's 190 million people, I mean, it kind of gets to this question that David was raising. Is it arbitration that's important or the class? If you take a few dollars from 190 million people, it's a lot of welfare loss. And this is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It's the consumer. It's $2 that you guys are interested in. So I really applaud this research effort and the facts that you're bringing to the table. I think it's really great.
Thank you. And I mean, we can talk about your back of the envelope calculations later, but thank you.
All right. Well, that wraps up the session, but we're going to have a few sort of logistical points made by our conference organizer, Carlos. Thank you very much on behalf of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for attending our first public meeting of the Academic Research Council. Carlos?
Thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping notes in terms of security procedures for when you return during lunch break. Please make sure that you keep your name badge. This is your identifier that you already registered for the conference. You will be going through another security screening on your way out as well, just to be aware of that, and then back on the way in. So all bags and luggage are going to be subject to inspection as well on the way out. There are a couple of lunch options around here. The closest one is the Department of Agriculture actually has a really good cafeteria, and it's just once you go outside, you can turn right on C Street, which is the first street, and it's on the opposite side of the street. You keep walking, it's on Wing 3. You just need to show your ID, and they will let you in. That's the closest option. Otherwise, you can continue on all the way to L'Enfant Plaza, and there's several shops and restaurants there as well. Or if you prefer to just do a little bit sightseeing for those visiting, just continue, instead of turning on C Street, continue on to Independence Avenue and then take a right and you'll get to the mall and the Smithsonian Museum there. Please feel free to ask us any questions. I'm right back here behind, and thank you for coming.